Okay, so we're going to move on to bigger questions. Well, I already said the thing about technology, so if somebody wants to bring that up again, please do. But I would like to say something a bit different now, which is about the spiritual aspect, which Luigino was talking about. I think it has a huge impact for Europe. I found when I had to participate in an EPP, intercultural, interreligious dialogue, sorry, thank you. And I looked around at some things that would be useful. I found some really interesting work by two American scholars, Brent Nelson and James Guth, on who have been the groups that have supported European unity over its history. And they show very clearly that basically it's the religious groups that have been supporting European unity. They also show, they do some work on Catholics because Catholics have been the most supportive group, but lots of other religious groups have been supporting as well. But young Catholics are getting less and less supportive of European. And I was trying to say to these members of European Parliament I was talking to, look, this is an issue for European unity. You know, we're not talking about it as a sort of religious issue. We're talking about it as an issue that has an impact on the political situation in Europe. And I think also it has a lot of impact on most of the issues that we're talking about today. You know, if we're going to have the motivation to work on community wealth building, if we're going to build this community that we're talking about, if we're going to, you know, move towards against a lot of resistance. I mean, one of the questions I would put to Joe is, you know, we've had cooperatives for, you know, 200 years. They've always been legally and economically handicapped by the situation that they've been. They've never really been able to express themselves properly. In some countries like Germany and Italy, they've had more of a chance. But even so, in terms of the global economy, they've always been pushed to the margins. I remember going to US and talking to the body that is the lobbying organization for cooperatives, and their stories about how the multinationals were just doing the most extraordinary things to keep them off and to stop legislation coming in that would help them. You know, if we're going to have people who are going to be strong enough to sort of move in this sort of circumstance, I think we really have to think about this spiritual dimension, apart from its importance in itself for people. So I just wanted to really reinforce that point from Luigino. Thank you.
Yes, Mateusz?
Yeah, two questions. Oh, sorry. So firstly, energy prices were signaled as a huge challenge for just transition. So an open question to all the panelists: what the EU can do to help low-income people with the rising prices? And a second question, and just one or two sentences of background. When a mining company moves out from a region in Poland, we will be in Cleveland situation before Joe gets there. So don't we need a job guarantee schemes, plural, localized, rooted very much in this kind of thinking about building on local resources rather than wishing for an investor like Amazon and Google to come up out of the sky and lower the standards of living. So yeah, and I'm also in this way somehow referring to Pawlina Czerneva, an expert on job guarantee, who will speak in the next panel. So if you, it's an open questions to all the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Mateusz. I suggest maybe that if you want to answer to the question on cooperative, and then I have Professor Buttiglione and Laurence together.
Yeah, certainly on cooperatives, they've been around for a very long time. And actually, I do think they speak in some ways to the spiritual dimension, and the people, you know, the beauty of owning your own job and working for yourself and so on is very important. But they haven't become systemically important outside of a few examples of regions around the world. And you mentioned some of them, Emilia-Romagna, close to here, but the Basque region with Mondragon, the social economy in Quebec, etc. But in all those instances, there were very important connections to culture, politics, but also finance, which is often a very difficult piece of the puzzle. Try raising capital to start a worker cooperative rather than a small business, despite the fact that when they get up, they are 3 times more likely to succeed and stick around than small businesses. On the other hand, I think it's interesting that these models are spreading in spite of all this. So in the United States, for example, at the moment, 1 in 3 Americans is a member of a co-op of one form or another. Agricultural and food co-ops, credit unions, which are essentially one member, one vote banks, etc. And so also employee ownership, not strictly cooperatives, but employee stock ownership plans and other forms have really been proceeding. One of the amazing things is there are now more workers who are part owners or outright owners of their own firms than are members of unions in the private sector in the United States now, 10 million. There's a problem though, right? Which is to do with this is not self-conscious as a movement and doesn't really have a wider politics associated with it. I think if I'm allowed to quote Marx, since he's already been raised, the kind of shift from a movement in itself to a movement for itself needs to happen with these new democratic economy institutions. And then the powerful way of scaling and driving them forward is really, I think, through this connection to public procurement and to industrial strategy and to deliberate ways in which we can grow these institutions that don't have to grow in the same way that private companies do, tend not to vote to move their own jobs offshore, don't naturally want to pollute their own community which they live in and are members of, and so on. And so I think, again, rolling up our sleeves and getting deeply into the detail of institutional forms and figuring out how to really link this up so that the grand vision of green deals and so on actually has somewhere to touch down and a place to stand institutionally in the local economy. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Professor Buttiglione?
Thank you. And before her, Luigino Bruni have brought up the question of spirituality. I think we should all, and Sister Helen has pointed out, that a lot of people that used to be supportive of the European Union have turned now against the European Union. We have a strong movement, grassroots movement, that is against the Union. We should ask ourselves the question, why? I don't have the answer, but perhaps I have one answer, one of many possible answers. I think we should not keep your eyes shut in front of the fact that we have given and lost a great cultural battle in Europe. It was the battle of the Constitution. The Constitution told us that Europe was a family of nations that have common cultural roots. We wanted those roots to be Christian, Jewish, Greek, Latin, and the great lesson of the Enlightenment. That was the formulation that I proposed. This was rejected. We made the referendum and the Constitution was rejected. And then we had the treaties of Lisbon, that is a coming back to Nice, that is almost nothing, just a bit more than nothing. And we had a union that has no cultural roots. Why are cultural roots important? Because when I have to make sacrifices, I want to know why. I have to spend a lot of money of the German taxpayers for Greece. They have cheated, they deserve to be punished. Why should I spend the money of the German taxpayers for Greece? That was the dilemma of Frau Merkel. And she said, we will not spend the money of the German taxpayers to support Greece. Because what are Greece? Like Hamlet, when Hamlet comments on Hecuba. Who is Hecuba to me? And who am I to Hecuba? What is Greece to me? What am I to Greece? And the result was dramatic because Greece collapsed and threatened to draw Germany, Italy, France, Germany and France more, into the abyss. And then we had to make an intervention. And it costed us much more than if we had said in the beginning, don't make speculations against Greece, we will defend Greece. And the Greek people had to suffer, nevertheless, tremendous social disruption. So the question of values is important. We gave a battle on values, we lost the battle on values, and now we are discovering that interests compel us to stand together. But it is difficult to stand together without values. And people see Europe as something that is imposed from the outside, not something that is an effect of their initiative. And I think that we should think it over on two levels. One is the level of values. We need a constitution. And in this constitution, we must have the courage of saying what are the values that stand at the basis of the European Union. And the second, we need a program. If we say to the people, we want Europe to be the guarantor of the fact that nobody will starve in Europe, that nobody will remain without, what is the formula of Pope Francis? Terra, techo, y trabajo. That all people will have a chance to find an adequate. If we put this into a program, then you have, again, a popular movement in favor of Europe. Because those who are against Europe are right. Yeah. This Europe is wrong. It's wrong because it is unable to provide the citizens with the goods the citizens want. They are wrong only on one point. They think that going back to the old national states, they could have. The national states have made Europe because they weren't able to deliver. But they've made a Europe that is not able to deliver. We must make steps further in order to make Europe able to deliver on the fundamental goods people want. A minimum wage, a minimum subsistence wage, a guaranteed basic income, the possibility of finding a job, the possibility of, and this implies also a proper relation between all these things and the self-consciousness that we have. To use the Marxist language, Hegelian more than Marxist language, an und für sich. What is Europe an und for itself, in itself, and for itself? If we do not succeed in telling this to the people, I don't see a great future for our union.
Thank you. Yes, so I have Laurence, Alexander, Professor Zamagni, and I just wanted to also check online, Mr. Andor and Professor Bruni, when you want to come in, let me know. Laurence?
Thank you, and thank you for this fascinating discussion. Listening to all this morning and seeing the tension between having a very clear plan for greening, of course, the Green Deal is about relatively clear plan, even if I agree it's a lot of ifs and still, of course, a lot to do. And at the same time, considering that even if finally the new direction of the European economy, which is not still a direction of the European society, which of course is a question, is really something where I think Europe is not wrong, but the problem will be really to base that on the social contract, what you are calling a constitution. So, and the ethos of Europe, if we want in a way this to happen, I think we are in a sort of complex moment where on the good side, because it was, even if of course the Green Deal was the response to citizen vote for the European election, the new, a little bit more affectio societatis for Europe, and we have to recognize that more people went to vote and more younger people went to vote and they vote for a greener Europe. So that in a way is a sort of a foundation. And then of course the response was entirely bureaucratic, like Brussels institutions are, and a sort of a very top-down design of what the policy should be. If we stay there, I think you were right, we will lose. if we don't have, again, the Green Deal as a social contract, was implied to redefine and explore and understand many elements, which probably this social, in a way, whatever we call them, the social safety net, a discussion on how democracy, in particular the workers' involvement, the community design plan can happen. So it's a vast redefinition. But I do think if we don't have, and that's why discussing with my colleagues in Poland and elsewhere, if we don't bring the Green Deal at home, meaning what is a Polish Green Deal? What is a German Green Deal? And then, unfortunately, because that's what we have, we don't have a European society still. And we should multiply again and again the Erasmus program, because that was, I think, the big progress we made to try to converge with values. But then out of this, in a way, citizen owning the Green Deal direction and trying to understand what will be the social contract in their own political context, and there are all difficulties we need. Maybe naming, we're having a different name, by the way, which probably, again, not saying it's a top-down decision we have to that affect us without us could, in a way, respond to. I think that would be a fantastic political adventure and a fantastic redefinition of the European identity. And, you know, when you look at the world level, we are just lucky. We can be sad and we can be understanding all the failures.
Sorry, we need to have questions, not conference. We have the opportunity to speak this
I
afternoon.
think we were in the debate, Marcelo. I think we were in the global debate now. So that's why, sorry.
No, yes, but debate, not a conference that you have the possibility to speak after.
I stopped there.
Okay, thank you. Alexander.
Yes. I have one question, short, but I think that, and the answer, I hope that it will be short, and maybe after one extra comment. My question is, there will be the summit of G20 in Rome in this month. What should be our postulates for them? Please, it's a question for all four panelists, including the Laszlo Andor and Luigino Bruni. Please answer in bullets if it's possible, because
Okay, Professor Zamagni.
Me?
Sì. Professor Zamagni, please.
No, thank you. Yes, I myself had an addendum to this spirituality foundation. Now, if we read the European Constitution, the 2004, I had better quoting, Europe is a community of common values. And in particular, is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and the respect for human rights, Article 1 and 2. Of course, as we know, the debate in those days, this is, but where is the novelty? Because these things we find already in the Declaration of Human Rights proclaimed by the United Nations in 1948. So it seems to me that what is missing today in particular is exactly a reconceptualization. It's not enough to state common values unless you indicate the process through which these common values are to be implemented. Let me remind, as Luigino Bruni knows very well, the market conceived as a model of social order, not as a marketplace. Marketplaces always existed, even in the past. But the market as a model of organized society is a typical European creation and invention. But at the time of humanism and onward, there was a big elaboration of what this concept of market presupposes in order to function properly. Now, it seems to me that in the Constitution of Europe and what follows after that was forgotten. The only point was adopted the notion of a market, which is nothing to do with the European values, nor with the European roots. We went just to follow other expressions, there is no need for me to quote exactly. In these regards, it's important what Pope Benedict XVI on September 2008, in his famous speech to the College de Bernardin in Paris, he stressed this point, 2008, hoping to be able to modify, but nothing happened. I have only just one line. I quote from him: monasticism is part of, and together with the culture of the world, a culture of work, without which the development of Europe, its ethos, and its conception of the world are unthinkable. And again, this speech was ridiculized, as we know it. Now, it seems to me that the excessive pragmatism in the name of a wrong notion of efficiency, because many people talk about efficiency, but believe me, very few know what does it mean. In particular, because efficiency was invented by Pareto, Italian economist, at the end of the 19th century. But Pareto clarified there are two notions of efficiency. But when he passed away, there was only one notion remained. And he referred to efficiency at the level of the individual, of the social entity, of the society. Now, Europe has forgotten exactly that. And that, in my opinion, explains the inadequacies and what sometimes we were saying yesterday and in the first part of this morning. Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
In
So-
substance, Europe forgot ora, not only labora, but also ora at San Benedict.
Okay, so I see Professor Bruni. I'm just taking, I have the neighbor of Laurence. I don't know the name. I'm sorry, I cannot see you. Professor Sachs and Mr. Lambert and Mache. Okay, Professor Bruni, please.
Okay, thank you very much. No, just the reference to ora et labora is already spoiled by Monsignor Redondo, then it's fine. No, because I think European humanism is also this, this interplay between working and spirituality. And that is not just a matter for monasteries, but is the briefing of European humanism. But this is already said. No, my issue was a reaction to what Professor Buttiglione said about the European constitution and values. As we know, the choice of the European fathers was to start from economy as a sort of first step towards a more political, cultural union. Why? Because in particular in the last decades, to agree about values was much more difficult than to agree about economy. That now, after or during or maybe after, we hope, this pandemic, and within this huge climatic and climate crisis, we are in a condition close to the condition of our countries after the Second World War. In Italy, for instance, it was possible to write together a constitution between communist, Catholic, socialist, liberal parties, because we were coming from fascism, from the tremendous pain of the war. I think today people are much more open to Europe than 2 years ago. In particular, not only in Italy, because we saw what Europe is also. Is help, is intensive care of Germany for people coming from Bergamo, was 200 more billions of euro for Italy from Europe. And then I think now is the right moment to ask for a constitution, because we are coming from a terrible crisis, common, as I said before, a common evil can help us to discover the common good. Then to conclude, what we have to avoid, Rocco, I think is the philosophy of the overlap consensus. Because if the constitution of Europe becomes the overlapping consensus among values, we conclude to write 2 or 3 lines about the general statement about humanity. But this is not Europe. Europe is the sum of values, not the overlapping of values, because the overlapping of values are too small. We need more. We know the unions of sets, not the overlapping of sets that is so solid that is not enough for a foundation of a new Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. Please go ahead. I cannot see your name. Yes, it's your turn.
I wish to go back to the first speakers, particularly Jeffrey. I think that if we want to really put in practice the Green Deal, we need to be more reflexive in policy and strategy. The first observation is that there is an interaction between society, let's say, social systems, social structures, and what we call sustainable development, environmental issues, and so on, the ecological transition. So what we need to take into consideration are the interactions between these 2 domains. And we cannot overlap them too much, which means that we should know the unintentional consequences of the actions taken by society onto the environment, to the economy, and so on and so forth. What I observe is that we are not aware of the unintentional perverse effects. For instance, you mentioned digitation, but digitation is commodifying work, very much indeed, in many realms. Take Amazon, for instance, corporation. What the workers are now embedded in is something which is really, I would say, alienation, a very stranger way of working. So the question is, don't you think that we need more a new awareness of the negative effects of what we take as a measure in order to achieve the Green Deal? I mean, we should be more reflexive on our own actions and the unintentional consequences of what. Take, for instance, the other case of social inequalities. Social inequalities, in many cases, are increased by the measures that we take to achieve the Green Deal. So we cannot really go on without being more aware of these negative unintentional effects of society on the issues of the Green Deal. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Sachs?
My impression is that there is a significant difference across countries on the issues we're talking about, and we should clarify that. There really is an Anglo-Saxon world that is different. There is not as much, in my view, the neoliberal ideas in most of Europe, and though it exists, maybe it exists partly on US influence, but it's really different. And we shouldn't generalize from the UK, the US, Ireland, Australia. to the situation in other countries. Part of the discussion we've been having just would never be had in Denmark or in Norway or in Italy or elsewhere in terms of underlying values. So, and that is a real fact of economies also. The main distinction is in the role of budgets. In the United States, total tax revenues are 30% of GDP. In Europe, they're 45% of GDP or higher, especially in Northern Europe. 15 to 20% of GDP, which goes for family support, which goes for social infrastructure, which goes for family leave time, which goes for many things. And the struggle that we're having in the United States is not, therefore, a general struggle. This is a weird country. Anglo-Saxon ideology is a weird splitting off of the mainstream of moral thought of 2,000 years, starting around 1700. And it's very distinctive, and it shaped our societies in a very different way. So that's the first point I want to mention. Second point is the European case. There is a need for more Europe to address many of these issues. The European issues in the last 10 years have had two phases. One, after the financial crisis, the situation was disastrously badly handled. And at the worst, and the worst was the European Central Bank under Trichet, but also pushed by the Bundesbank. And the idea was a common currency without a lender of last resort. So that's where the worst was felt in Europe. And Mario Draghi saved the euro, and he saved Europe by doing what central banks ought to do in the modern world, which was to backstop the countries that have that currency. So I think that was a phase that was a really weird phase. Very bad policy, very bad misunderstanding of monetary policy, especially by Jan Wiedmann and the Bundesbank, and Schäuble, whose view was get Greece and maybe some others out of the European Union. So we should understand that this, and not out of the European Union, excuse me, out of the Eurozone. So the idea was break the euro by the most important finance minister in Europe. This was a phase. It lasted till about 2016. It was what strangled Greece. It was very particular. Then there's a more general issue in Europe, which is that the budget of the European Union is 1% roughly of Europe. This is ununderstandable to me. If you want to have a union, you need some fiscal union. 1% of GDP is not a fiscal union. It's not accepted by many. Actually, the most resistant to fiscal transfers this last time around, the so-called frugal four, including countries like Denmark that know all about taxation. They tax almost 50% of GDP, but they said not through Europe. This is Europe's biggest risk. You can't have a monetary union without an active central bank, and you can't have a social union without a bigger budget at the European level. This is the biggest flaw of the European scene right now.
And no fiscal havens.
And no
fiscal havens inside Europe.
That's the point.
That is the super scandal.
Yeah. So just to say,
Northumberland.
Final point. Of course, globalization and the Anglo-Saxon world gave a race to the bottom. And this should be understood also because this started with Thatcher and Reagan in the 1980s. And it started with the tax cuts which in a world of mobile capital drove everything down. Now, this week, maybe at the G20, we'll finalize at least a floor on taxes. Yesterday, Estonia and Ireland said they're in at least the minimum 15%. Maybe we can start now returning to some decency rather than a race to the bottom.
Yeah.
But just to say, this has been the malign influence of the Anglo-Saxon vision that created this race to the bottom without any backstop. And I thank President Biden for trying to, for the first time in
if
40
the
years.
Anglo-Saxon go out, the Anglo-Saxon go out of the European countries. So this is the ridiculous thing also.
Yeah, well, this is a huge loss for the UK. It's just sad, this departure, but it may clarify things for the rest of Europe to hang together. And for Poland, with all the friends and the American image, don't follow the American way, believe me. That's what I would tell you.
Yeah.
You know, follow the continental European way of your neighborhood, not the American way, which is where the image was in the early years of the transformation.
Thank you. Mr. Lambert, please.
Yes. Well, first a remark, I think the fact that the UK left the European Union is also a big loss for the European Union, but we can come back on that later. Actually, I heard a lot of music to my ears during the exchange, and most of you pleaded for what sounds like a paradigm shift, right? We cannot just try to fix a system that is inherently producing the kind of bad results that we see in terms of climate, in terms of inequality and all the rest of it. Yet, I find there's broad agreement around the table here. But when I look at the landscape in Europe, I have the feeling that even though many of our citizens may share that sort of gut feeling that something needs to change fundamentally, this is not what we see in terms of balance of power. So you might say that's your job as a politician, but I will talk about that later. But what I would like to ask you is to feed into what I'm going to say later. What is your view about why is it that despite inequality, despite rising concentration of wealth, despite environmental destruction, why is it that many of our fellow citizens still find themselves, like we saw in Germany last weekend, or well, a few weeks ago now, find, well, okay, well, maybe our guts, but no, our brains tell us that change is needed, but our guts tell us, well, let's keep it as it is.
Okay, so I'm just checking also the time. I still have Maciej, John, Esther, and Christo. So I really ask you to be short so that maybe we can have also some words of wrap up, especially from the speakers.
Thank you. I have a question to Professor Sachs, and it is a question on timing, because I enjoyed your speech a lot, but I slightly disagree with the focus on 2050. This is a long horizon, and it often serves as an excuse for inaction. We can always wait for better times with transition and so on. And now what IPCC tells us, we have no more time to waste, and every year counts. We need to cut emissions quick and large. So in my view, very briefly, we should look for activities truly regenerative, which have these both social and ecological feedbacks, especially since pandemics is still with us. They may require substantial public investment and even to cut deliberately some industrial most polluting activity by new tax measures. But I would like to hear from you, what should be the public priorities for next 2-3 years? Not over the long run, but 2-3 years, and ways of financing them as well. Thank you.
If you want to answer very quickly, I'm sorry, I know it's not easy.
The idea of 2050 is not to delay. The idea of 2050 is an anchor, that your anchor is at zero. What it tells you, for example, in the International Energy Agency report released this spring on net zero by 2050, is You can't invest in any new fossil fuel-based infrastructure now.
Yeah.
It's not to say, oh, 2050, I do something. It is to tell you anything which lasts more than 28 years has to be clean. Otherwise, it can't be fit within a 2050 timeline. So it says, don't invest in gas that's better than coal. That will absolutely not work. So it's an anchor. It is not a matter of delay. And what I'm not advocating is make an announcement. I'm advocating a plan to 2050. That is a ramp. And when you make the plan, what does it call for today? Move now, because otherwise you're going to strand your economy. So there's no contradiction, except if it's misunderstood, which it could be, which is, oh, we have 28 years. That's not the point. The point is make a plan that ends at 0 in 2050, and it will tell you a lot about what to do this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you. Please, Jan.
So I'm really glad that we seem to have this shared clear recognition that on the systemic level, the model of neoliberal capitalism has failed, and that we need a new system altogether. But now, as much as I like and also engage in my professional activity in community wealth building in Poland related to Green Deal, we need to stress that it works on a micro level, on the bottom, on a grassroots level. Whereas on a systemic level, we have to cope with different issues, right? We have very strong entrenched interests, especially of technology companies. We could even call it basically class warfare that is happening. We have the other dimensions of technology, data, platforms. It's not that we can remain local in a world that can communicate globally all the time. And then also we have the outward limits. So the limits of the capacity of the planet, of resources. And this has to be seen on a planetary level to some extent. So my question, and I think it's mostly a question either to Professor Sachs or to Joe, even if we have this community wealth building on a local level, I'm for it. How to connect it with some kind of other systemic way of doing things, of running economy that takes into account the limits of resources and that somehow uses the possibilities of data, of technology, maybe to take back this planning that we have, but corporate planning, and kind of socialize it to some extent. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. So please, Esther.
So I'm going to just grab the floor to quickly answer the question, which was bullet points for the G20. And this is incredibly difficult for me because I've been part of the L20, which came up with all the labor points, and I'm also part of the W20, which is the women's agenda. So picking one or two bullet points is hard, but I'm going to do it. So I think we need to call for the foundations for a new social contract for recovery and resilience. That we need to call for an economy built on achieving social justice outcomes. We need to call for an industrial policy framework that anticipates change. And we need to make certain that workers and their unions are guaranteed a place at the discussion table, both at the enterprise level, the regional level, and at the national level, to come up with those solutions that are sustainable. And we need to make sure that there's enough resources for quality jobs, quality job creation, and that public procurement rules, final point, public procurement rules don't stop driving a race to the bottom and start driving the race to the top.
Thank you, Esther, for this. Also wrapping up a little bit some of the points that have been raised throughout the session. I'm sure we have a couple of more to add, But Christophe, and then I try to pass to this afternoon.
Just really briefly trying to sum up all the thoughts. If Joe Guinan is right, and I think he is, that there is a conscious structuring going on for decades of the global economy that by design concentrates the wealth at the top. And if many of us probably are not as optimistic as Jeffrey Sachs about this not being as much applicable to the EU, that the balance of power, of the social power in the economy is still tipped in favor of the powerful, and we see inequalities in member states of the European Union persist, then the climate catastrophe that we will see unfolding over the years and decades will definitely, of course, it will shift inaction into action, but it will not only be an opportunity, but as I think Professor Donati was hinting, it may also be a danger, that it will only accelerate social unraveling, which leads to this thought that not necessarily all action against the climate catastrophe, increasing budget may necessarily be good. And what we need to do, what is actually absolutely necessary, is for some political force to act as a countervailing power, as Rocco Buttiglione suggested, some political, social movement on the European level to check the power of business. And unless that is happening, the just transition will be just words, and it definitely won't be just.
Thank you, Christophe, for also this reflection and this summary. So just to conclude, I see still 1 minute. Okay.
Just a factual point. If you look at the evolution of the income distribution, it's completely different in Europe and certainly in Northern Europe from the United States. In the United States, in the last 25 years, the share of the top 1% went from about 10% of national income to 21% now. This did not happen in most of Europe, where the share of the top 1%, even if it rose a quite small amount. This is resistible. I'm not guaranteeing it's resisted, but I'm saying there's a big difference between the United States and Europe, and build on that.
Thank you. So before going to lunch, just wanted to say thank you for the brilliant exchange. I think it was very rich. There are some questions we didn't answer, so I really invite you also maybe to make the opportunity of the lunch break to continue bilaterally. There are, though, I think, various level of inputs and of reflections that have been raised throughout the morning that we can pull together, I think, also with the organizer in terms of concrete also elements that we want to put forward vis-a-vis the European Green Deal, but also, as Alexander raised, like vis-a-vis the upcoming G20. But there are also more, like, I would say, longer term discussions, and there were even ideas on new opportunities to coming and continue coming together to discuss these interesting issues. So I really thank you, everyone. And I'm sure also that especially the last panel this afternoon can pick up some of the elements that have been raised. So I hand over to the chair.